From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore. Welcome to this edition of From the Quarries. Tonight's topic is The Origin of Modern Masonry, a lecture first presented in the early 1940s by JH Parkes. Before I get started, a word or two about Brother Parkes. I have been lucky enough to come across the complete archive of all of his Masonic writings spanning some 30, 40 or maybe 50 years, which is all stored at the Robert Burns Lodge in Toowoomba. This comprises hundreds and hundreds of handwritten pages of notes, lectures, addresses, correspondence for this remarkable man. I am still researching his full Masonic history and hope to bring that to you at some future date, but I do know that by the late 1960s he was the Grand Lecturer for the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Queensland. Tonight's lecture, though, is from a much earlier time in his career. It's undated, but from the look of the paper, the text, and the sort of work that's involved, I think it's probably from the early 1940s. I know he was very active in the Rockhampton area in 1941 and 1942, so I suspect tonight's lecture is from that period. So here we go. The Origins of Modern Masonry by JH Parkes. Masonry has existed from time immemorial. It can be traced down through the ages in various forms and operating under different names. These include the Ancient Mysteries, the Dionysian Artificers, and the Roman Allegiates. Masonry was practiced long before the building of King Solomon's Temple, yet substantially the same by remaining anchored to those fundamental principles generally referred to as the ancient landmarks. It adapted itself to the changing periods of time, and having come down through the ages, we find it practiced in an alternative way in the 12th century. Operative Masonry could be said to have come into existence with the rise of Gothic architecture. Masons were travelling Europe, building cathedrals, abbeys, and sacred edifices, holding lodges wherever they met. Under such circumstances, is it any wonder that a religious element began to creep in? Prior to 1700, Masonry existed in two forms. The first, operative building guilds, and the second, in a variety of secret communities of mystics and occultists, having no relation to the practical building trade, but often using builders' terminology for symbolical purposes of their own. Modern Masonry is a blend both of these. Its constitutions, charges, rituals, and instruction lectures incorporate elements drawn from each of them. Manuscripts which have come down to us from the 14th and 15th centuries suggest that the craft was organized all over the country, and that the masons who were engaged in building the abbeys and cathedrals saw to it that the travelling craftsmen would find work and welcome wherever they went. A member of such a fraternity would be independent of the authorities who controlled the artisans working in the towns, and one explanation is that the Freemason was so called because, as an independent craftsman, he was free from the trade restrictions that were enforced by local guilds. Such a craftsman would necessarily be more skillful than any resident in a town, for he would be abreast of the very latest developments and discoveries of the masters of Gothic architecture throughout the country. And the Freemason, when we first meet with him in the 14th century, is in fact a more skillful craftsman. Whilst Germany and France each developed their individual style of architecture, English and Scottish craftsmen evolved another and distinct organisation in which a gradually increasing element of non-operative or speculative members developed the elaborate ceremonial of that system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols, that we know as Freemasonry today. Gothic architecture began its period of decline in the 15th century. When cathedral buildings ceased, a good many of the guilds passed out of existence. Some maintained their activities by taking in domestic architecture. To what extent the newly transformed guilds maintained their old customs it is difficult to say, for records are lacking, but we know that such as continued to exist remained very jealous of their traditions and very loyal to their landmarks. There was, however, one exception to this. After the lodges had come to be comparatively weak in number and membership, and after they had been working for many years in close contact with the rich and learned class, they began to admit to their membership men who had no thought of becoming actual builders at all, but who developed an interest in the ancient craft because of its traditions and its rich symbolism. Section 2. What took place in the old operative lodges? We are informed from reliable sources that the operatives met and conducted their meetings wherever they worked. So long as Gothic architecture was a living art, the lodge was essentially the workroom, and there was no membership of the lodge in the sense in which that expression is used today. Freemasons were members of a fraternity, and all those at work in each locality assembled and worked in its lodge under the instruction of the master of the work, while in the room itself a senior mason appointed by his fellows was responsible for discipline. It is impossible to know exactly how the candidate was given the apprentice's part in the old days, but many hints have been left to us, embedded in the old charges, as the ancient manuscripts were called. Brother E. L. Hawkins culled all these references and composed a mosaic picture of the old-time ceremony. The meeting was opened with prayer. The legendary history of the craft was then read. Then the candidate was led forward and instructed to place his hand on the volume of the sacred law, which was held by one of the seniors, while the articles binding on all Masons alike were read, at the conclusion of which a brief obligation was imposed upon the candidate, all present joining in it. Then followed the special charges for an apprentice, concluding with a longer obligation by which the candidate specially bound himself to secrecy with regard to what he was about to be communicated to him. Then the secrets, whatever they were, maybe modes of recognition, were entrusted to him and the proceedings terminated. Before receiving the first degree, the youth was obliged to prove himself well qualified, of lawful age, free-born, sound in mind and of clean habits, and in good repute. At the same time, he was compelled to bind, or indenture, himself to his master mason for a term of years, usually 7. This master set him his tasks, taught him the methods of the craft, and saw to it that he faithfully observed the rules and regulations of the order, and kept inviolate the secrets of the craft and of his fellow workmen. At first, the apprentice was little more than a servant, performing menial tasks, but as his skills increased, he was given more important duties. After 7 years, the apprentice brought his masterpiece to the lodge, or, in earlier times, to the annual assemblies, and on strict trial and due examination was declared a master. Thereupon he ceased to be a pupil and servant, and passed into the ranks of fellow crafts, capable for the first time in his life of earning his living and choosing his own employer. Getting back to our story of the progress of the operatives, as time went on, a new state of affairs developed. Originally, when the Masons met to work, non-operatives were allowed to be present only because they individually had an interest in or could advance that work. But when work was no longer to be had, the Masons in many localities continued to meet and to admit other persons as members of the fraternity. They spoke of their meetings as lodges. They preserved and read the old charges, copies of which were at great pains to transcribe from time to time, and kept up some of the practices not only of the craft guilds, but also of those old social guilds which had been done away with at the Reformation. Speculatives were first admitted in the latter part of the 16th century. At this time there were lodges scattered here and there throughout England and Scotland, and probably much diversity in their working customs and usages. The question here arises, why did soldiers, scholars, antiquarians, clergymen, lawyers, and even members of the nobility ask to be admitted and accepted as members of the order? Wherefore their interest in the craft at all? What had them to it as far back as 1600? What held them with increasing power and an even ever deepening interest? Why did they continue to enter the lodges until eventually they had the control of them? There must have been something more in their motive than a simple desire for association, for they had their own clubs, societies, and learned fellowships. Still less could a mere curiosity to learn certain signs and passwords have held such men long, even in an age of quaint conceits in the matter of association and when architecture was affected as a fad. The explanation is that these men saw in Masonry a deposit of high and great truth, preserved in tradition and taught in symbols, turning history into allegory and legend into drama, and teaching the fundamental truths of human fellowship based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. Section 3. Time for an awakening came when a few lodges in and around London, early in 1717, thought fit to cement under a Grand Master as the centre of union and harmony. Just how many lodges existed in and around London at that time we do not know, but only 4 came in at first. What was England like when Grand Lodge was formed in 1717? Very unlike the England of our day. Old things were passing away and all things were becoming new, and yet, compared with the England we know, darkness was still upon the face of the deep. 1/5 of the population was composed of beggars and paupers. Corruption reigned in high places, and brutality prevailed in low. Small wonder that the spirit of man was growing restless. And in 1717, the streams of Masonic influence suddenly sprang from their hitherto concealed channels into the light of day, and so the Grand Lodge was formed. The truth that the honest worker is in partnership with God had crystallization in the teachings of Freemasonry, which exalts the builder to partnership with the grand architect of the universe. 100 lodges with perhaps 1,000 masons in England, Ireland, and Scotland had taught this truth during the centuries that preceded the birth of the English Constitution and prepared the way for it. The idea exists in many directions that the revival of Masonry in 1717 was the outcome of the Reformation, the process and growth of thought being so gradual that when the event came to pass, its origin had been lost trace of. Section 4. The formation of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717. No doubt there were preliminary meetings, and that masters of lodges around London were consulted as to what was proposed, but whether the brethren realized the full importance of the move they were making, it is impossible to say. Although there were many lodges working in and around London, and many other parts of England, Scotland, and Ireland, only those around London were consulted, the idea being that the Grand Lodge would only claim jurisdiction over this area. In February 1717, four of the lodges then existing in London were united to form the Grand Lodge of England, and on the 24th of June, at the first annual assembly, Mr. Anthony Sayer was elected the first Grand Master. This is Sayer's first reference in Freemasonry. Unfortunately, the minutes of the Grand Lodge only commence on June 24th, 1723. For the history, therefore, of the first 6 years of the new regime, we are mainly dependent on the accounts given by Dr. Anderson in the Constitutions of 1728. Nothing whatever relating to the proceedings of the Grand Lodge, except the general regulations of 1721, having been inserted in the earlier edition of 1723. Here is the official record given by Dr. Anderson. King George I entered London most magnificently on the 20th of September 1714, and after the rebellion was over, AD 1716, the few lodges at London, finding themselves neglected by Sir Christopher Wren, thought fit to cement under a Grand Master as the centre of union and harmony, viz., the lodges that met 1. at the Goose and Gridiron Ale House in St Paul's Churchyard. 2. At the Crown Ale House in Parkes Lane near Drury Lane. 3. At the Apple Tree Tavern in Charles Street, Covent Garden. And 4. At the Rummer and Grape Tavern in Channel Row, Westminster. They and some old brothers met at the said Apple Tree Tavern, and having put into the chair the oldest master mason, now the master of a lodge, they constituted themselves as a Grand Lodge, pro tempore, in due form, and forthwith revived the quarterly communication of the officers of lodges, called the Grand Lodge. They resolved to hold the annual assembly and feast, and then to choose a Grand Master from among themselves, till they should have the honour of a noble brother at their head. Accordingly, on St. John Baptist's Day, in the 3rd year of King George I, AD 1717, the assembly and feast of the free and accepted Masons was held at the aforesaid places. Before dinner, the oldest Master Mason, now the Master of a Lodge, in the chair, proposed a list of proper candidates, and the brethren by a majority of hands elected Mr. Anthony Sayer, gentleman, Grand Master of Masons, who, being forthwith invested with the badges of office and the power by the said oldest master, and installed, was duly congratulated by the assembly, who paid him the homage due. Sayer, now Grand Master, commanded the masters and wardens of the lodges to meet the grand officers every quarter in communication at the place that he should appoint in his summons sent by the Tyler. And so we have the first Grand Lodge, formed in 1717. Section 5. What progress did this first Grand Lodge of England make? Only 4 lodges had come in. There were others around London and in many parts of England and Scotland. Several objected to the self-imposed authority, but lodges gradually came in, and by 1723 Grand Lodge was controlling 30 lodges. What of the management of this Grand Lodge and the conduct of Masonic affairs? It could be said that a gradual effort was made to organise Freemasonry. George Payne was elected Grand Master in 1718 and took a prominent part in the affairs of the society. With the appointment of the Reverend J. T. de Saglier as Grand Master in 1719, Masonry had, as a leader, one who had already distinguished himself as a scholar, and he had considerable influence. In 1720, George Payne was again elected Grand Master. His experience in this office already seems to have proved an advantage to the craft. No doubt he could see the need for organising the lodges, and as Grand Master, Payne now took a step which was to have a remarkable effect on our history. He ordered to be drawn up a set of regulations for the management of the craft in London and Westminster, which completely altered the whole position of the brethren. The lodges were now to be regularly organised bodies, with set officers and days of meetings and bylaws, and they were restricted as to their powers of admitting Masons. It should be noted that by this time, a good many of the lodges then existing had a majority of speculative members. The new Grand Lodge constituted itself a supreme authority and forbade new lodges to be formed without its warrant, and it retained in its own hands the power to advance apprentices to a higher degree. Elaborate rules were also drawn up for the conduct of business in Grand Lodge and for its periodical meetings. Grand Master Payne's regulations were drawn up expressly for the lodges in and about London and Westminster, and, under the designation of Constitutions, a work issued in 1723 for the use of lodges, which included them, and a history and a set of charges. It was no part of the original intention that the system should extend any further, nor was it anticipated at the time by either Payne or Anderson, who compiled them. But, when lodges came to be formed all over England, it became necessary to abrogate the restrictions originally placed by Payne on the advancement of apprentices to a higher degree. Accordingly, this rule directing that this could only be done in Grand Lodge was unanimously rescinded at the meeting of the 27th of November, 1725. The vitality of the newly formed Grand Lodge lasted, and in 1721 12 lodges were represented at the quarterly communications. By 1723 the number had increased to 30. In 1723 the old lodge working at York objected to the authority of the new Grand Lodge and called itself a Grand Lodge, and in 1729 Irish Masons instituted a Grand Lodge of their own, and in 1736 Scotland did likewise. There now appeared in London a number of Irish Freemasons, men of very humble social Masons nevertheless, and following the usages that in their minds were associated with the craft from time immemorial. Not only did they find the Grand Lodge following different practices, but these Irish Masons were refused recognition by that body. They therefore, in 1751, took the strong step of forming a Grand Committee of their own, which in 1753 made itself into a Grand Lodge, and they called themselves the Ancients to indicate they stood for the true tradition, and the original Grand Lodge they described as Moderns, in reference to the innovations it had introduced. At one time, four Grand Lodges were operating in London alone, and 5 in all England. By 1809, only the ancient and modern Grand Lodges were left, and they were drawing closely together. A lodge of promulgation was set up to restore the true ceremonies, which was overseen by a committee of both Grand Lodges, who set to work to decide on the terms of union. The strong feeling and competition among these two Grand Lodges during the next few years created a great deal of attention from influential people, and each Grand Lodge chartered a tremendous number of lodges, not only in England but abroad. But, after negotiating time, union was brought about in 1813 by the formation of the United Grand Lodge of England. Section 6. The United Grand Lodge of England of 1813. As only 2 Grand Lodges remained at this time, and with the passing of the original instigators, union eventually came about. Only these 2 Grand Lodges had granted charters outside of England, and each brought a list of several hundred lodges, the union altogether embracing 1,000 lodges. The Articles of Union were signed on the 25th of November 1813 and took effect from the 27th of December 1813. Clause 1 of the Articles of Union creates the 2 Grand Lodges into one brotherhood. Clause 2 reads, "It is declared and pronounced that future ancient Masonry consists of 3 degrees and no more, viz., those of the Entered Apprentice, Fellow Craft, and Master Mason, including the Supreme Order of the Holy Royal Arch. But this article is not intended to prevent any lodge or chapter from holding a meeting in any of the degrees of the Order of Chivalry according to the constitutions of the said order." Clause 3 reads, "There shall be the most perfect unity of obligation, of discipline, of working the lodge, of making, passing, and raising, instructing, and clothing brothers, so that but one pure, unsullied system, according to the genuine landmarks, laws, and traditions of the craft, shall be maintained, upheld, and practiced throughout the Masonic world, from the day and date of the said union, until time shall be no more." Clauses 4 and 5 provide for universal working, according to the established customs, usages, and landmarks of the order, and a lodge of reconciliation to be constituted to decide on this. The Articles of Union are very complete and far-reaching, and reflect credit on the part of those responsible for the forethought. The influence which this union has had means the Masonic world as we now know it. And that is the end of the lecture.